Hi everyone, welcome. For each topic, I'll be asking you to view these short video clips like this one, where I summarize the big takeaways, which are the critical elements of each week's lesson that you absolutely just have to know. Watch these big takeaways videos that involve me pulling together some big ideas, sometimes across multiple chapters as the semester goes forward. This will help you see the bigger picture of psychology and our inner life and feelings. So please watch these videos for each module coming up. So to begin, the big takeaways for Chapter 1, called Introduction to Psychology, are these. First, number one, psychology is a science and a practice. Two types of psychologists accomplish the goals of psychology. Research psychologists work at universities and they conduct experiments to study the relationships between brain and behavior, which is our next chapter, as well as developmental events over the lifespan. They study children, adults, and seniors, and social experiences and interpersonal experiences that impact our lives. Research psychologists work at universities. Clinical psychologists work at clinics and hospitals and use that research knowledge to try to make people's lives better when they struggle. Clinical psychologists specialize in diagnosis and treatment of mental disorders such as anxiety, depression, phobias, schizophrenia. When most people think of a psychologist, they tend to think of the duties of a clinical psychologist. So, first big takeaway, know that psychology is both a science and a practice. Second big takeaway, psychology has its origins in philosophy, in the humanities, but we are science. Philosophy is the rational investigation of the principles of being and knowledge. Most college students will complete at least one course in philosophy. Historically, the field of psychology distinguished itself as a science when we broke off from philosophy and began using the scientific method. Studying human behaviors, we began to infer underlying thoughts and emotional states with greater validity and reliability using the scientific method. You may have heard of that from any of your earlier science classes, the scientific method. So know that psychology is a social science. It's not part of the humanities. Psychology is defined as the scientific study of human behavior and mental processes. Now, a behavior is anything that can be observed. And we're distinct from philosophy in our insistence that we objectively verify these invisible mental processes called thoughts and feelings. How we measure those invisible, intangible mental processes is actually a pretty important part of psychologists' effort to conduct valid research and makes our field pretty distinct. Most mental processes are experienced privately, so they cannot be directly observed, making psychological science a real challenge and really, really interesting. To be called a science, our topic of interest must be objectively verifiable, but so much of what interests us is inside the mind. So we must ask questions, we must create tests, we must observe carefully the behavior of people so as to infer what is happening in the privacy of their minds. Psychological science is really challenging for this reason. The third big takeaway in this chapter, psychological perspectives, refer to the multiple existing theories that psychologists use to explain human behavior and human experience. Sigmund Freud was the first major theorist in psychology, so he is the most well-known. His popular id, ego, and superego, those concepts, drew us inward, inside our thoughts and feelings, to examine rich experiences of the world and a complex emotional life within. He was the first. You may have heard of Sigmund Freud before this chapter. Many other psychologists followed to develop important theories about human experience. They're introduced in this first chapter, but they'll come up again in subsequent chapters. They all collectively brought us to where the science is today. The point about psychological perspectives is that multiple theories really are needed in psychology to understand the complexity of human experiences. All of the psychology perspectives discussed in this chapter are valid and in use right now by psychological scientists and by practitioners. Lastly, the fourth big takeaway in this chapter, be sure you're familiar with the three domains of human experience: thoughts, feelings, and subsequent behavior. Now, you may never have heard this concept, but we dissect human experience into three domains in order to better understand behavior when we see it. Thoughts come first. Then thoughts drive feelings. And feelings and thoughts together, thoughts and feelings together, drive behavior. Thoughts come first. Thoughts then drive feelings, and thoughts and feelings together create some subsequent behavior. So for psychologists, when we're seeing behavior and wondering why does a person do this, we only need to trace back this path to understand the thoughts and feelings behind what is observed. That's a really foundational idea, the 3 domains of human experience. Be sure you understand them and the order that they go in. So in summary, the big takeaways from this first chapter, called Introduction to Psychology, are these. Number 1, psychology is both a science and a practice. Research psychologists gather knowledge, and then clinical psychologists use this knowledge to make people's lives better. Number 2, psychology has its origins in philosophy, in the humanities, but we are a scientist and we use the scientific method. And big takeaway number 3, psychological perspectives refer to the multiple theories that psychologists use today to explain human experience. And lastly, be familiar with the 3 domains of human experience: thoughts, feelings, and subsequent behavior. Those are the big takeaways from this first chapter, chapter 1, called Introduction to Psychology. Thank you, everyone.